The Agony of Power by Jean Baudrillard. Read by Stеaдyй Делта. Part 2. The White Terror of World Order. Absorbing the negative continues to be the problem. When the emancipated slave internalizes the master, the work of the negative is abolished. Domination becomes hegemony. Power can show itself positively and overtly in good conscience and complete self-evidence. It is unquestionable and global. But the game is not over yet, for while the slave internalizes the master, power also internalizes the slave who denies it, and it denies itself in the process. Negativity reemerges as irony, mocking the auto-liquidation internal to power. This is how the slave devours and cannibalizes the master from the inside. As power absorbs the negative, it is devoured by what it absorbs. There is justice in reversibility. A catastrophic dialectic has replaced the work of the negative. Critical thought, or any attempt to attack the system from the inside, is in a complete aporia. After voluntary servitude, which was the secret key to exercising domination, one could now speak instead of involuntary complicity, consensus, and connivance with the world order, by everything that seems to oppose it. Images, even radical critical ones, are still part of the crime they denounce, albeit an involutionary one. What is the impact of a film like Darwin's Nightmare, which denounces racial discrimination in Tanzania? It will tour the Western world and reinforce the endogamy, the cultural and political autarky of this separate world through images and the consumption of images. And yet, by the same token, all critical negativity, all the work of the negative is abolished, devoured by signs and simulacra. In the context of hegemony, the historical work of critical thought, the relationship of forces against oppression, radical subjectivity against alienation, are all virtually in the past, simply because this new hegemonic configuration, which is no longer the configuration of capitalism at all, has itself absorbed the negative and used it for a leap forward through the meanders of cynical reasoning or the tricks of history. The absolute negative, terrorism, internal deterrence, responds to the absolute positive of positivized power. When domination becomes hegemony, negativity becomes terrorism. Thus, hegemony is a metastable form because it has absorbed the negative, but by the same token, lacking the possibility of dialectical balance, it remains infinitely fragile. Its victory, therefore, is only apparent, and its total positivity, this resorption of the negative, anticipates its own dissolution. It is, therefore, both the twilight of critical thought and the agony of power. Through a reverse effect, however, the system enters a catastrophic dialectic. But this dialectic is a far cry from the Marxist dialectic and the teleological role of negation. For this strategy of development and growth is fatal, as it entirely fulfills itself in a final achievement that no negativity can hinder. It becomes incapable of surpassing itself upwards and initiates a process of self-annihilation. For this strategy of development and growth is fatal, as it entirely fulfills itself in a final achievement that no negativity can hinder. It becomes incapable of surpassing itself upwards, Aufhebung, and initiates a process of self-annihilation, Aufhebung, in the sense of dissolution. For the system, in the context of global power, this strategy of development and growth is fatal. The system cannot prevent its destiny from being accomplished, integrally realized, and therefore driven into automatic self-destruction by the ostensible mechanisms of its reproduction. Its shape is similar to what is called turbocapitalism, The term turbo should be taken literally in this expression. It means that the system as a whole is no longer driven by historical forces, but is absorbed by its final conditions, hastened to its definitive end, like a turbo engine, sucking in the space in front of it, creating a vacuum, and the force of attraction of a vacuum. It is not a progressive, continuous evolution, even if it is confrontational and contradictory. Instead, it is a vertiginous, irresistible attraction to its own end. If negativity is totally engulfed by the system, if there is no more work of the negative, positivity sabotages itself in its completion. At the height of its hegemony, power cannibalizes itself, and the work of the negative is replaced by an immense work of mourning. We can even forget about capital and capitalism. Didn't they reach the point where they would destroy their own conditions of existence? Can we still speak of a market or even of a classical economy? In its historical definition, capitalism presided over the multiplication of exchanges under the auspices of value. The market obeys the law of value and equivalency, and the crisis of capital can always be resolved by regulating value. This is no longer true for the financial flows and international speculations that far surpass the laws of the market. Can we still speak of capital when faced with an exponential strategy that pushes capital beyond its limits in a whirlwind of exchanges, where it loses its very essence and is dispersed in an unbridled circulation that brings the very concept of exchange to an end? Having lost its rational principle, the principle of value, exchange becomes total just as reality, having lost its reality principle, becomes total reality. It may be the fatal destination of capital to go to the end of exchange, toward total consumption of reality. In any case, we are bound for this generalized exchange, this frenetic communication and information that is the sign of hegemony. The dimension of hegemony is different from that of capital, and different from the dimension of power in its strictly political definition. It is no longer a question of political power tied to a history and a form of representation. Representation itself has lost its principle, and the democratic illusion is complete, not through the violation of rights, but through the simulation of values and the derealization of all reality. The masquerade, again, everyone caught in the signs of power, and communing in the rigged unfolding of the political stage. With the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor of California, we are deep in the masquerade, where politics is only a game of idolatry and marketing. It is a giant step toward the end of the system of representation. This is the destiny of contemporary politicians. Those who live by the show will die by the show. This is true for both citizens and politicians. It is the imminent justice of the media. You want the power of the image? Then you will die through its replay. The carnival of the image is also self-cannibalization through the image. One should not conclude too hastily that the degradation of American political practices is a decline in power. Behind this masquerade, there is a vast political strategy, certainly not deliberate. It would require too much intelligence, that belies our eternal democratic illusions. By electing Schwarzenegger or in Bush's rigged election in 2000, in this bewildering parody of all systems of representation, America took revenge for the disdain of which it is the object. In this way, it proved its imaginary power, because no one can equal it in its headlong course into the democratic masquerade, into the nihilist enterprise of liquidating value and a more total simulation than even in the area of finance and weapons. America has a long head start. This extreme empirical and technical form of mockery and the profanation of values, this radical obscenity and total impiety of a people otherwise known as religious, this is what fascinates everyone. This is what we enjoy, even through rejection and sarcasm. This phenomenal vulgarity, a political, televisual universe. Brought to the 0 degree of culture, it is also the secret of global hegemony. I say it without irony, even with admiration. This is how America, through radical simulation, dominates the rest of the world. It serves as a model, while taking its revenge on the rest of the world, which is infinitely superior to it in symbolic terms. The challenge of America is the challenge of desperate simulation, of a masquerade it imposes on the rest of the world, including the desperate simulacrum of military power, carnivalization of power, and that challenge cannot be met. We have neither a finality nor a counter-finality that can oppose it. In its hegemonic function, power is a virtual configuration that metabolizes any element to serve its own purposes. It could be made of countless intelligent particles, but its opaque structure would not change. It is like a body that changes its cells constantly while remaining the same. Soon, every molecule of the American nation will have come from somewhere else, as if by transfusion. America will be black, Indian, Hispanic, and Puerto Rican while remaining America. It will be all the more mythically American in that it will no longer be authentically American, and all the more fundamentalist in that it will no longer have a foundation, even though it never had one, since even the founding fathers came from somewhere else, and all the more bigoted in that it will have become, in fact, multiracial and multicultural, and all the more imperialist in that it will be led by the descendants of slaves. That is the subtle and unassailable logic of power. It cannot be changed. The global masquerade of power passes through several phases. First, in the name of universals, the West imposes its political and economic models on the entire world, along with its principle of technical rationality. That was the essence of its domination, but not yet its quintessence. Beyond economics and politics, its quintessence relies on the hold of simulation, an operational simulation of every value, every culture. That is where hegemony today asserts itself. No longer through exporting techniques, values, ideologies, but through the universal extrapolation of a parity of these values. Underdeveloped countries keep aligning themselves on a simulacrum of development and growth. They got their independence from a simulacrum of democracy, and every endangered culture dreams of a staged rehabilitation, all fascinated by the same universal model of which America, while benefiting from it, is the first victim. Thus, after imposing its domination through history, the West is now imposing its hegemony through a farce of history. Global power is the power of the simulacrum. Moreover, Western civilization also had a motive for revenge. It had to take revenge on others for the loss of its own values. Many people underestimate the fierce jealousy mixed with nostalgia of a disenchanted culture for all singular cultures, and it continues to do so in the context of globalization, which, at bottom, beyond its technical operation, is a giant project meant to symbolically liquidate all values through consensus or force. After the sacrifice of value, after the sacrifice of representation, after the sacrifice of reality, the West is now characterized by the deliberate sacrifice of everything through which a human being keeps some value in his or her own eyes. The terrorist's potluck against the West is their own death. Our potluck is indignity, immodesty, obscenity, degradation, and abjection. This is the movement of our culture, where the stakes keep rising. Our truth is always on the side of unveiling, desublimation. reductive analysis, the truth of the repressed, exhibition, avowal, nudity. Nothing is true unless it is desecrated, objectified, stripped of its aura, or dragged on stage. Indifferentiation of values, but also indifference to ourselves. We cannot involve our own death because we already are dead. We throw this indifference and abjection at others like a challenge. The challenge to defile themselves in return, to deny their values, to strip naked, confess, admit, to respond with a nihilism equal to our own. We try to take it all from them by force, through the humiliations of Abu Ghraib, prohibiting veils in school. But it is not enough for our victory. They have come on their own, sacrificed themselves on the altar of obscenity, transparency, pornography, and global simulation. They have to lose their symbolic defenses and take the path of neoliberal order, total democracy, and integrated spectacle. In this sense, we can, with Boris Groys, conceive of the hypothesis of a double potlack, the Western potlack of nullity, self-degradation, shame, and mortification opposed to the terrorist potlack of death. But the deliberate sacrifice by the West of all its values, of everything through which a culture holds value in its own eyes, in this prostitution of the self, thrown into the face of the other as a weapon of mass deterrence, seduction, through emptiness and challenge to the other, Islam, but also the rest of the world, to prostitute itself in return, to unveil itself, to give up all its secrets and lose all sovereignty. Does this immense self-immolation constitute a veritable symbolic response to the challenge of the terrorists? Let's not speak of war or a fight against evil, which are admissions of a total inability to respond symbolically to the challenge of death. Potlack versus potlack. Does one balance the other? One might say that one is a potlack by excess, the potlack of death, and the other a potlack by default, self-mockery and shame. In that case, they do not match each other equally, and one should speak of an asymmetrical potlack. Or should one think that, in the end, no form, not even the challenge of death, of extreme sacrifice, can be considered superior, nor can the terrorist challenge be seen as superior to the inverse Western challenge, and therefore send each one back to its respective delirium? What is at stake in global confrontation is this provocation to generalized exchange, the unbridled exchange of all differences, the challenge for other cultures to equal us in deculturation, the debasement of values, the adhesion to the most disenchanted models. This confrontation is not quite a clash of civilizations, but it is not economic or political either, and today it only concerns the West and Islam in appearance. Fundamentally, it is a duel, and its stakes are symbolic: physical and mental liquidation, a universal carnivalization imposed by the West at the cost of its own humiliation, its symbolic expropriation, against all of the singularities that resist it. Challenge versus challenge? Potlack versus potlack? Does the slow death strategy or systemic mortification equal the stakes of a sacrificial death? Can this confrontation come to an end? And what could be the consequences if one or the other wins? The response to domination is well known: slave revolt, class struggle, all the historical forms of revolt and revolution, the metamorphoses of the work of the negative. History as we knew it, and rewrote it along its evolution to an ideal end. The response to hegemony is not as simple. Irredentism, dissidence, antagonism, violent abreaction, but also fascination and total ambivalence, for we all are part and parcel of this hegemony, unlike the clear distinction between dominance and dominated. whence both a vital, visceral resistance to generalized exchange, to total equivalence and connection, to vast prostitution, and a vertiginous attraction to this technological fair, this spectacular masquerade, this nullity. At bottom, it is clear that this apogee of global power is also the apotheosis of the negative, the triumph of resignation, of the renunciation by the species of its own values. There is nothing more exciting than this vertigo, no longer the work of the negative, but the vertigo of denial and artifice. Whence this dual, insoluble postulate opposing this global power and losing oneself in it, an ambivalence that we all experience at each moment, and which is the mirror in each one of us of the global antagonism. This hegemonic simulation, a configuration that seems triumphant and unyielding, has its reverse, its revulsive effects. By virtually yielding to this global dynamic and exaggerating it in several ways, all of these would-be emerging countries gradually become submerging instead. They slowly invade the Western sphere, not on a competitive level, but like a groundswell. This invasion occurs in many ways, like a viral infiltration. It is the problem of the global, more or less clandestine immigration. Hispanics are literally cannibalizing the United States, but also in the contemporary forms of terror, a true filterable virus made up of terrorism and counterterrorism, and which is a violent abreaction to global domination, destabilizing it from the inside. The global order is cannibalized by terror. However, there are other, more political forms for these tendencies hostile to Western models. All of these countries that we want to acculturate by force with the principles of political and economic rationality, with the global market and democracy, with the universal principle and a history that is not their own, of which they have neither the ends nor the means, all of these countries which make up the rest of the world, they give us the impression, in Brazil for example, that they will never be acculturated to this exogenous model of calculation and growth, that they are deeply allergic to it. And in fact, do we, Westerners, masters of the world, still have its ends and means? Do we still measure up to this universal undertaking of mastery that now seems to surpass us in every domain and function like a trap, of which we are the first victims? History itself is a product for Western export. We dump on others a desire for history through national conflicts, international institutions, access to the global markets, while for us, in reality, history is over, in the sense that it unfolds on its own, on automatic pilot, and more often than not, in a loop. For us, the mirror of history, the continuity of history, is shattered. We live in an instant and disincarnate currentness in which we take no more trouble, according to Dostoevsky's phrase, than to prolong history, or rather the end of history, immersed in the euphoric banality that Heidegger called the second fall of humanity. But the others, those who did not experience this historic stage, this mirror stage, can only want to enjoy in themselves, dreaming of the Western power in which everything that took the form of history culminates, and perhaps dreaming to destroy its symbols and take a stand against it. It is a strange situation wherein all these people, who at the same time dream of entering history, or rather today, in the pacified, securized, extraterritorial, extra-national zone of universal free trade, in the world order of welfare, of which America is obviously the model, and simultaneously resist it. A double contradictory statement of which Turkey is a fine example. To join Europe for the Turks means leaving an archaic structure to enter modernity, to become a part of the technological universe of consumerism and simulation, of the cosmopolitan exchange of signs, and the formal liberty to use them at one's leisure. At the same time, it means partaking in a radical critique of this political economy, a denunciation of the culture that fascinates them, and remaining deeply allergic to the principle of exchange and undifferentiated exchange that requires the sacrifice of their distinctive cultural traits. In the end, if we look closely, it's the same situation we are in as individuals at the heart of modern societies. We all experience an irresistible urge for this society of science and simulacra that is at the end of history, and a deep resistance to this voluntary servitude, so much so that we might retrospectively wonder whether all this history, all of this Western rationality and modernity, really took place, or whether this is all a parody of an event that had happened, leaving us to share its spoils. This would be the farce of history that Marx mentions, and to which we involved as accomplices, those who did not even benefit from it. History that repeats itself turns to farce, but a farce that repeats itself ends up making a history. This means that by repeating and doubling themselves up, even simulacra end up forming our material destiny, the only day of reckoning we have the right to now, and maybe the only retrospective truth of history that, in this hypothesis, did not even wait to be repeated to become a farce. We can, in this sense, speak of the ephemeral, unstable, and reversible character of modernity, and of reality in general, and a different rate of universalization of rational values and the principle of reality that presides over them. One should not believe that reality is equally distributed over the surface of the globe, as if we were dealing with an objective world that was equal for everyone. Zones, entire continents, have not seen the appearance of reality and its principle. They are underdeveloped in this generic sense that is more profound than the economic, technical, or political. The West, after passing through a historic stage of reality, entered the virtual stage of ultra-reality. By contrast, a majority of the rest of the world have not even reached the stage of reality and economic, political, etc. rationality. Between the two, there are zones of reality, interstices, alveoli, shreds of reality that survive in the hearts of globalization and the hyper-reality of networks, a bit like the shreds of territory that float to the surface of the map in Borges' fable. One could speak of an index of reality, a rate of reality on the planet that could be mapped out like birth rates, or the levels of atmospheric pollution. What would the maximum rate of reality be? It remains to be seen whether this underdevelopment is a curse, if the non-access to the real and the rational is an absolute tragedy or its contrary. One can ask this question when considering the advanced zones, the hypermodern zones like our own that are already far from reality, that have lost its principle, that have devoured it in a way, in the space of 2 centuries, like any mineral fuel or natural deposit. Moreover, the exhausting of reality goes hand in hand with the exhausting of natural resources. Hyperreal zones, still sublunar, but already extraterrestrial, at once globalized and deterritorialized. Opposition to a global hegemony cannot be the same as opposition to traditional oppression. It can only be something unpredictable, irreducible to the preventive terror of programming, forced circulation, irreducible to the white terror of the world order, something antagonistic in the literal sense that opens a hole in this Western agony, something that leaves a trace in the monotony of the global order of terror, something that reintroduces a form of impossible exchange in this generalized exchange. Hegemony is only broken by this type of event, by anything that erupts as unexchangeable singularity. A revolt, therefore, that targets systematic deregulation under the cover of forced conviviality, that targets the total organization of reality. The high point of the struggle against domination was the historic movement of liberation, be it political, sexual, or otherwise, a continuous movement, with guiding ideas and visible actors. But liberation also occurred with exchanges and markets, which brings us to this terrifying paradox. All of the liberation fights against domination only paved the way for hegemony, the reign of general exchange, against which there is no possible revolution since everything is already liberated. Total revolt responds to total order, not just dialectical conflict. At this point, it is double or nothing. The system shatters and drags the universal away in its disintegration. It is vain to want to restore universal values from the debris of globalization, the dream of rediscovered universality. But did it ever exist? That could put a stop to global hegemony, the dream of a reinvention of politics and democracy, and, as for us, the dream of a Europe bearing an alternative model of civilization opposed to neoliberal hegemony. This dream is without hope. Once the mirror of universality is broken, which is like the mirror stage of our modernity, only fragments remain. Scattered fragments. Globalization automatically entails, in the same movement, fragmentation and deepening discrimination. And our fate is for a universe that no longer has anything universal about it, fragmentary and fractal, but that no doubt leaves the field free for all singularities, the worst and the best, the most violent and the most poetic